11 December 1943. A siding outside Lyon, occupied France. A goods yard sits quiet under a bruised winter sky. A rail worker crouches beside a stationary locomotive, shovel in hand, filling the tender with coal for the morning run. He works quickly, hands blackened, breath visible in the cold. Somewhere among the thousands of lumps he shifts that night sits one that does not belong. It weighs the same. It looks the same, dusted with the same fine black grit. But inside, where anthracite should be solid through, there is a cavity packed with explosive. Sealed and painted with the same craftsman's care, a forger gives a banknote. The locomotive pulls away before dawn, bound for a German-controlled marshalling yard where it will be loaded with matériel for the Atlantic Wall. It never reaches its destination in one piece. Somewhere along the line, in the white heat of the firebox, that single indistinguishable lump ignites at furnace temperature. The boiler ruptures. The locomotive is finished, and with it, days of German rail capacity vanish along a corridor that cannot afford to lose them. No one saw it placed. No one saw it detonate, not in the way a saboteur sees an explosion they have set with their own hands and run from. The men who built this weapon designed it precisely so that its use would look like nothing at all. An ordinary mechanical failure, the sort of thing that happens to tired locomotives in a war-strained rail network. That was the entire point. In a conflict where resistance fighters faced execution for possession of a single detonator, an explosive that never needed to be planted by hand, never needed a timer set or a trigger pulled by a human being standing nearby, was not merely convenient. It was survival. This is the story of an object that looks to any eye like nothing more than fuel for a stove. It is the story of why British scientists decided that the most effective weapon of the Second World War might be one that nobody could ever recognize as a weapon at all, and why, for the men and women risking their lives in the shadows of occupied Europe, that quality of invisibility mattered more than raw, destructive power. The war that Britain found itself fighting from the summer of 1940 was not, for a great many of its participants, a war of front lines and formations. After the fall of France, continental Europe became a landscape of occupation, and resistance to that occupation had to be waged by civilians. Railwaymen, farmers, clerks, teachers, who had no uniforms, no formal training in the previous generation's soldiering, and no means of concealing weapons in a society where the occupying power conducted searches as a matter of routine. The Special Operations Executive, formed in July 1940 on Winston Churchill's instruction to set Europe ablaze, inherited an extraordinarily difficult brief. Arm and equip a scattered, amateur, desperately vulnerable resistance movement using methods that would not get its members shot on discovery. Conventional sabotage equipment failed this test almost immediately. A stick of gelignite, a coil of detonating cord, a clockwork timer, these were the tools of demolition as the British Army understood them, and every one of them was instantly recognizable to a German search party. Being caught with such items was, in occupied France, Belgium, Norway, or Poland, tantamount to a death sentence, and not only for the individual caught. Reprisals against resistance activity frequently extended to entire villages. The problem SOE's planners faced was not simply how to blow things up. It was how to arm ordinary people with the capacity to destroy strategic infrastructure while giving them nothing that a search, a checkpoint, or a suspicious neighbor could ever identify as incriminating. The scale of the challenge was immense. German-occupied Europe by 1941 depended on an enormous logistical apparatus. Railways moving troops and material, factories converted to war production, power stations feeding it all. Conventional bombing raids could strike such targets from the air, but at a horrendous cost in aircraft and aircrew, and often with limited precision against small, well-defended point targets like a single locomotive boiler or a specific machine tool. Sabotage from within offered a way to strike precisely at such vulnerabilities, but only if the saboteurs could get close to their targets without detection, and only if what they carried could survive the scrutiny of an occupying army that grew more paranoid and more thorough in its searches, as resistance activity increased through 1941 and 1942. There was a further, subtler dimension to the problem. Coal was not just abundant in this landscape, it was untouchable, precisely because it was everywhere. Every locomotive depot, every factory boiler house, every ship's bunker consumed it by the ton, shoveled by hand by workers who rarely inspected individual lumps with any care at all. It was, in the driest sense, the perfect Trojan horse, provided someone could actually build one convincing enough to survive contact with a real coal pile, a real shovel, and a real fireman's eye, all without a chemist's laboratory giving the game away through smell, weight, or texture. Nobody had managed that before. The task fell eventually to a research establishment that most of Britain did not know existed. The organization responsible was Station 9, SOE's dedicated research and development establishment at the Frythe, a country house near Welwyn in Hertfordshire, which the organization's staff came to refer to simply as Welwyn. It functioned as SOE's answer to a Defense Ministry laboratory staffed by chemists, engineers, and, crucially, model makers and artists whose job was not merely to make things explode, but to make them convincingly resemble the mundane objects they were meant to replace. Under the direction of men such as Colonel Jeffress and, on the disguise side, artists skilled in painting and casting, Station 9 produced an entire catalog of camouflage devices, exploding rats intended to be shoveled into boiler fireboxes by unsuspecting German stokers, explosive-filled logs, and the device that would prove one of the program's most effective, a lump of coal that was not coal at all. The construction relied on a hollow casing, cast to match the irregular asymmetric shape that real coal always has, since real coal never breaks into neat geometric chunks. Early versions used a shell molded from a mixture designed to mimic anthracite in weight and appearance once painted and coated in genuine coal dust, so that the surface residue on a worker's hands after handling it would be indistinguishable from the real thing. Inside the shell sat a charge of plastic explosive, sufficient to rupture a locomotive firebox or boiler when the surrounding fuel bed reached its working temperature. The device required no timer, no trigger, no human intervention at the moment of detonation. It relied entirely on the ordinary operating heat of the machine it was meant to destroy. In practical terms, a device roughly the size and weight of a real lump of household coal, perhaps a kilogram or so, carried enough explosive force to destroy the very machinery that unwittingly consumed it. The devices were manufactured and prepared for distribution through SOE's supply chain, packed among agents' equipment drops or infiltrated directly into industrial coal stocks by resistance contacts working within depots and factories. Exact production figures remain unclear. Much of Station 9's output records were never fully declassified, and what survives suggests batches numbering in the low hundreds rather than mass industrial production, reflecting both the labor-intensive nature of hand-finishing each piece to look convincingly irregular, and the fact that the device was a specialist tool rather than a mainstay of the sabotage arsenal. Getting an explosive coal lump from Welwyn into a genuine coal store required patience and a level of everyday courage that rarely makes it into the history books. Resistance operatives working as railway employees, colliery workers, or factory hands would introduce individual pieces into coal stocks destined for German use, sometimes one lump at a time over weeks, waiting for chance and a shovel to do what a detonator never could. Documented instances of locomotive boiler failures attributed to sabotage exist in French and Norwegian resistance accounts, though the fog of wartime record-keeping means it is often impossible to state with certainty which specific incidents were caused by the coal device rather than conventional explosives or genuine mechanical failure. A deliberate feature of the weapon's design, since ambiguity of cause was itself protection for the network that planted it. What is clear from surviving testimony is the psychological toll such uncertainty took on German rail and industrial personnel who could never fully trust the fuel supply they handled every day, turning a mundane task into a source of quiet dread. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It makes a real difference to channels covering this kind of forgotten history. Germany pursued its own sabotage research through the Abwehr and later RSHA technical sections, but the emphasis differed markedly from Britain's approach. German-designed sabotage devices, such as those intended for use by agents infiltrating Allied territory, tended to prioritize conventional timer mechanisms and were less consistently disguised as everyday consumables. Where camouflage was used, it often took cruder forms, such as explosives packed into ordinary luggage rather than reconstructed to survive close physical handling and combustion. American efforts, coordinated through the Office of Strategic Services and its own research division, developed comparable concealment devices, including incendiary devices disguised as animal droppings for use against vehicle fuel tanks, and explosive charges built into everyday items for resistance use in the Pacific and European theaters. The American Aunt Jemima explosive, a compound that could be baked into the appearance and texture of ordinary flour, arguably rivaled the Cole device in ingenuity, and the two Allied programs shared some research through liaison channels between SOE and OSS. What distinguished the British Cole bomb specifically was its reliance on the target's own operating heat as the detonation mechanism, removing any need for a timer that might fail, be discovered, or require the saboteur to remain nearby. A design philosophy that reduced human risk to close to its practical minimum for this category of device. Assessing the Cole bomb's material impact against the wider Allied war effort demands honesty about the limits of the evidence. It was never intended, and never claimed by SOE, to inflict damage on the scale of strategic bombing. A handful of destroyed locomotives and boilers, however disruptive locally, did not shift the war's material balance in the way that sustained air campaigns against German industry did. Its significance lies elsewhere, in the demonstration that even the most policed, most searched, most tightly controlled occupied environment could never be made entirely safe for the occupying power, because the very fuel that kept their trains running and their factories warm might, at any moment, be waiting to destroy them. That psychological dividend sustained fear among railway and industrial personnel who had no way of knowing whether any given lump of coal was safe, arguably outlasted the material damage the device caused. The concept also fed directly into post-war Special Forces doctrine regarding disguised and improvised munitions, and echoes of Station 9's design philosophy, ordinary objects rendered lethal, persisted in the sabotage handbooks of intelligence services long after 1945. Surviving examples of the device, along with much of Station 9's wider catalog of camouflaged weapons, are held today at the Imperial War Museum and in the SOE-related collections maintained by institutions researching wartime special operations, offering visitors a rare, tangible link to a form of warfare that left almost no trace by design. Return for a moment to that goods yard outside Lyon, to the rail worker shoveling coal in the dark, unaware that his ordinary task had become, however briefly and without his knowledge, an act of war waged on Britain's behalf. That is the entire quiet genius of what Station 9 built. Not a bigger bomb, not a cleverer timer, a lump of coal that asked nothing of the people who used it except that they do exactly what they would have done anyway, and in doing so, destroy the machinery of an occupation they may never have had the means to resist any other way. Britain did not win the war by inventing the explosive coal bomb, and no honest account of the conflict would suggest otherwise. But in a war fought as much through fear, disruption, and the slow erosion of an occupier's confidence in its own infrastructure as through open battle, this small, blackened, unremarkable object earned its place in the story. It asked no one to be a hero in the conventional sense. It asked only that an ordinary object be allowed to do what ordinary objects always do, until, at the moment the enemy least expected it, it did not. What looked like fuel was, in truth, a verdict, waiting patiently in the dark for the fire that would deliver it, and in occupied Europe, in yards and boiler rooms and coal cellars from Norway to the Rhone, that patient, unremarkable verdict was already being written into the fabric of the everyday, one indistinguishable black lump at a time.